Hello, everybody. Today we're going to talk about the psychologists in the legal system. As you know, the psychological approach focuses on the individual as the unit of analysis. Psychologists look at human behavior. They try to make sense of human behavior in various contexts, and obviously we're interested in the legal system. There are two other social sciences that might be interested in law. That's anthropology and sociology, but their emphasis tends to be on culture or society. So as a psychologist, we're interested in the individual human. So one thing I want to do before we really get started here is I want to clear up some confusion that I find that a lot of students have. And that's the difference between psychologists, psychiatrists, and counselors. And you may see any one of these people in the legal system operating in some way or another. First, psychiatrists. Psychiatrists have a medical degree. They have an MD, and after they complete their MD, they do some extra training and residency in psychiatry. So they're primarily medical doctors with extra training in human behavior. Oops. The next is psychologists. Psychologists have either a PhD or a PsyD. I don't know how many of you know the difference between the two, but a PsyD is a professional degree. You probably won't be expected to do research, and you probably won't have to do a formal dissertation or thesis. And if you're in a PsyD program, you're definitely in clinical psychology. There is no such thing as a PsyD program for experimental. A psychologist, PhD or PsyD, will have 4 to 7 years of post-baccalaureate training. And it depends on which discipline of psychology you go into. And of course, a psychologist can be either a clinical psychologist or an experimental psychologist. By the way, I'm an experimental psychologist. I don't do any kind of clinical work at all. I'm basically a researcher. The last group is the counselor. And the counselor has normally a master's degree, but there are counselors who have PhDs. But counseling is typically slightly different from psychology. They may do very similar jobs, but again, definitely clinically oriented in treatment and so forth and so on. So a counselor will have 2 to 3 years of post-baccalaureate training for the most part. Okay, so hopefully this clears this up. I find that students often get these different professions completely mixed up. Now, in terms of subfields that are relevant to psychology and law, now we're focusing on psychology again. You're going to hear some different terms being used, and I want to clear this up as well. So some people use the term forensic psychology. Forensic psychology refers to a very specific type of psychology and law. A person who's practicing forensic psychology is a clinical psychologist. They do things like, for example, assess dangerousness and maybe report to parole boards. They might assess a defendant to try to figure out if they were insane at the time they committed the crime. These are definitely clinical psychologists. Okay? Another type of psychologist or subdivision is a psychologist that has both a PhD and a JD. In other words, they went to a joint psychology and law program, and they got their PhD in psychology, and they got the law degree, the JD, in their law program. And there aren't that many programs around the country. One of the biggest, by the way, is at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And people who come out of these programs have a PhD, they have a JD PhD. Okay? The next group is the group that they're psychologists who are interested in law, so they do not have law degrees. And this is actually where I'm at. I'm a psychologist, but my interest is in the legal area, and I do all my research in the legal area. And so the students that come to my program, that come to UW to go to graduate school, they're going in a psychology program, but they're just studying legal issues through a psychological lens. The last two people you may run into once in a while, also psychologists, and that is a police psychologist. As the name implies, they would be working with a police department. They may have to assess officers after a shooting, provide some counseling, so forth and so on. As you might guess, this person is going to be a clinical psychologist. And finally, you may hear of what's called correctional psychology. And correctional psychologists, just as the name implies, they would be working with inmates, people in correction facilities. And they are also going to be clinical psychologists. Now, you may run into any of these terms, but hopefully now you know what the difference is. So let's look at how psychologists interact with the legal system. They actually can work with the legal system in many different ways and in many different roles, some of which I've actually practiced. And so I'll point it out when we get to some of those. The first way that we interact with the legal system is as a basic and applied researcher. And by the way, that's pretty much what I am at this point. I consider myself a researcher first and foremost. And what we do is we take the scientific method and use it to answer legal questions. Questions like, under what conditions are eyewitnesses not very good witnesses? How do jurors make decisions? Things like that. Now, the advantages of being an applied researcher, and you're going to see this throughout the course. There are many issues in the criminal justice system that psychologists have studied and found better ways to do certain things. And the advantages, as I see it, is some of the work that I do actually gets applied to the legal system, and there are changes that are made based on the research that we do. So it's really wonderful to see that your work actually has an impact. One of the disadvantages, however, is that sometimes the legal system misuses your research. Research always has its limitations, and if people in the legal system start using some of your work to their advantage when that's not the way it was meant to be used, that's something that can happen as well. And you're definitely going to see this as we move through the course. In terms of ethical issues, a basic or applied researcher, we're bound by our research ethics. There are certain things in the legal system that we cannot really study adequately. We try to study what's in the real world, but we might not be able to study it adequately. For example, one of the things that we think is a problem in the legal system is this issue that some people confess to crimes that they didn't commit. And it turns out that people who confess to crimes they didn't commit, they're often interrogated for long periods of time. Now, this is not something that we could study in a lab because there's no way we could subject people to 11 hours of interrogations in order to study how it works. So we do have our limitations. What we're going to be doing in this class is talking a lot about some of the contributions that the researchers have made to the legal system, but I'm just going to throw out a couple here to begin with. First of all, one of the most important contributions that psycholegal researchers have made to the system is to understand the limitations of eyewitness memory and to improve lineup identification. There are methods that were being used by the police department departments all over the country. These lineup methods that lead to errors. And so we've been able to now, with 25 years of research, identify the problems and figure out what the solutions are. Another area that we've made some huge contributions is to understand suggestibility of children. Children in the 80s were alleging that they had been abused in daycares, and some of the interviews that these children were subjected to were truly horrible and may have caused many false reports. So psycholegal researchers again rolled up their sleeves, figured out what was going wrong, and have developed better interviews for children that we use today. Finally, in the 90s, there was a rash of repressed and recovered memories that were then taken to the courts. The researchers, again, were able to identify the therapeutic techniques that were being used in therapy that could lead to false memories. And now those kinds of techniques are not typically used by clinicians. So we've made contributions, and those are some of the things that we're going to be talking about as the class goes on. Another way in which psychologists can interact with the legal system is as an expert witness. An expert witness, and by the way, I have been an expert on several cases. An expert witness possesses special knowledge about a subject. And in some cases, the attorneys will say, well, we need an expert to talk about this. The judge can decide whether or not an expert will be allowed. So the judge has the ultimate say. If the judge says, yes, if we need an expert here, then they will say yes. And what the expert needs to do is to provide some information that's not available to a typical juror. So for example, maybe the average person on the street doesn't realize all the conditions that can make eyewitness identification faulty. So maybe an expert needs to come in and explain to jurors to be careful. Okay. When an expert is brought in, they usually identify their credentials. They'll say where I went to school, what I've been doing, et cetera, and then the judge will turn to the opposing attorney and say, do you accept this person as an expert? And typically the opposing attorney will say yes, okay, because obviously they brought you in with your credentials. Chances are you're not going to be opposed. The role of an expert witness, though, is supposed to be an impartial educator. You're not supposed to be partial to one side or the other. You're simply presenting the research as you know it, or what you've managed to glean by looking at the documents in the case. You're just simply supposed to educate the juror. You're not jury. You're not supposed to in any way suggest that the defendant might be guilty or not guilty. Of course, there are ethical issues as an expert witness. You're supposed to be impartial, but you have been hired by one side to represent them. And so there's always the issue that you might be perceived as the hired gun. In other words, they're paying you enough money to come in and be an expert, and you will side with them. Most attorneys, opposing attorneys, will ask the expert pretty early on, how much are you getting paid for this case? And of course, if you're getting paid a whole lot of money, the jurors may then discount some of the things that you say. So, in terms of expert testimony, what can an expert say? Well, according to our ethical rules, our testimony must be based on legitimate scientific knowledge. You cannot introduce junk science into the courtroom. Now, I say that you cannot, but I do have to say that some people do. If the courts don't know that the science is junk, then a psychologist or an expert can say some things that are just blatantly not accepted. In federal courts and in some state courts, they have what's called the Daubert rule for expert testimony. The Daubert rule states that the science that you're talking about in the courtroom has to generally be accepted in the field. So that most other psychologists would agree with what I am saying. That's the Daubert rule. Now, mind you, in order to catch somebody who's not up to speed, the legal players would have to know that this person is spouting junk science or science that's not generally accepted in the field. And so again, there may be some slippage there. Okay, so that's an expert witness. Another way in which psychologists can interact with the legal system is as a policy evaluator. They recommend or evaluate changes to the legal system. Ethical issues here, obviously, you know, sometimes our policymakers have their own agenda. And so you may try to do the research and the data shows X, but they want to do Y. And so they want you to somehow make Y come out. And it just doesn't work that way. So you're getting push and pull from people who actually make statute. And as you know, they have their own agenda. So you have to stay true to what the data tells you. The last way in which psychologists can interact with the legal system, up until this point, virtually everybody I've talked about here is supposed to be impartial. They're not supposed to be on one side or the other. But the last role that a psychologist may find themselves in is an advocate. And an advocate identifies with one side. So for example, in the state of Wyoming, there's a group of people who have jobs, they're called victim advocates. they identify with one side. They're not concerned about the rights of the defendant. They're simply concerned with the victim. Okay, so they're an advocate. One type of advocate is what's called a jury consultant. Jury consultants work with one side or the other, and they try to help that one side that has hired them to put the best trial on that they possibly can. There can be pro bono jury consultants, but for the most part, they are paid. Okay. They're also used mostly in civil cases. The reason why they're mostly used in civil cases is jury consultants can be extremely expensive, and most defendants don't have that kind of money. In fact, it's civil cases that involve corporations that may use jury consultants. So, for example, hiring a jury consultant in a case can cost anywhere from $60,000 to $125,000. So it's a very expensive thing to use, and so that's why it's used mostly in the civil cases. And what jury consultants do is they use the scientific method to kind of tilt the outcomes to make their side win. And of course, the ethical issues here, some people say, they're trying to tilt the case, they're rigging the jury, they're pushing their agenda, but it's no different from what attorneys try to do as well. In fact, the American Society of Trial Consultants is in the process of defining their ethical guidelines, so it's a fairly new field. Let me show you an example of jury consulting. So, for example, here I have a short video that sort of explains the benefits of having a jury consultant.
Hi, I'm Dr. Thomas Baggett, and I'm the founder of the
I
Jury
don't know if
Behavior
that
Research
sound is coming
Corporation.
through you.
I'd like
through
to tell
your
you
video.
why we are different than the other trial consulting agencies. First of all of our consultants hold doctoral degrees in behavioral science fields. Among us, we have more than 50 years experience. Hi, I'm Dr. Thomas Baggett, and I'm the founder of the Jury Behavior Research Corporation. I'd like to tell you why we are different than the other trial consulting agencies. First of all of our consultants hold doctoral degrees in behavioral science fields. Among us, we have more than 50 years experience in and out of the courtroom working within the legal system. We follow a stringent code of ethics, and we have a strict scientific protocol for all of our pretrial research. On the day of the research itself, before even beginning with evidence, we establish a baseline with our jurors by having them predict how they think they will find at the end of the day. We have found that it's important to know how much effect geography and demographics have on your probable outcome. We take extensive measurements throughout the day so that we can tell you not just what the verdict was, but why that particular verdict was found. We take extensive measurements so we can examine the cognitions of individual jurors and the jurors as a group to tell you where your case was strong and where your case was weak. We employ safeguards to assure that we measure evidence and not just attorney skills. We evaluate attorneys in 7 different categories so that in the end we can determine whether it was the force of one attorney that overpowered the other or whether we actually measured evidence. At the conclusion of the on-site part of the research project, we examine the data and recommend modifications to improve your position prior to trial. We are able to forecast the probable outcome of the case if it is presented unchanged. If liability is found, we can give you an accurate estimate of the high and low of what the damages will probably be. Lastly, after we're done with the on-site part of the research project, we examine all the data, including the written comments by all the jurors made throughout the day. We're able to determine what was important to the jurors, what changed their minds, what made them find the way that they did. We then use this information to help you develop trial strategies to maximize your outcome. At Jury Behavior Research, we're very proud of our return rate of clients. They come back to us over and over because of the value of the type of research we provide. We put our clients in their best possible position to settle or go to trial. We look forward to hearing from you.
So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what these consultants do. They may actually run the trial with another sample of people, and they try to figure out where the case is weak, make suggestions, so forth and so on. Here's another little short video. Again, I think it's the same gentleman talking about jury selection and trial consulting.
Well, more than 200 Tucsonans were filling out a questionnaire today in one high-profile double murder case. 12 people ultimately will determine whether a father murdered his 2 young children. Let's get you some background with the quick facts on this, though. Pima County prosecutors say that they will seek the death penalty for Christopher Payne. He's the father of 4-year-old Ariana and 5-year-old Tyler. Tyler's body has never been found. Court documents claim that Payne abused the children before killing them sometime between March and September of 2006. News 4's Rebecca Taylor joining us now with some new details in the case.
Christy, late today, defense attorneys were denied a motion to suppress statements made by Christopher Payne to police allegedly admitting that children died in his care. I sat down with a jury consultant who shares the ins and outs of jury selection. As a jury trial consultant, Dr. Tom Baggett's job isn't picking jurors, it's weeding them out.
So both sides are looking for people that are biased, that won't give us a fair shake.
Dr. Baggett isn't working the capital murder trial of Christopher Payne, but from experience knows which jurors he'd avoid.
The most obvious would be people that have been victimized by violent crime.
Deselecting jurors with hidden opinions is crucial to winning. The first step is the juror questionnaire.
Questionnaires to me, as a behavioral scientist, are critical. If I were to ask you questions about sexuality or behavior, drug abuse, alcohol use, you would tend to be more honest on a document than you would be in open court.
Potential questions even include a person's favorite TV shows.
CSI fans, 24 fans, they have very fixed ideas on how they think a court system should be.
Payne's trial, which begins February 17th, could last 6 to 8 weeks. Precious time many jurors just don't have.
It's very problematic.
Earning $20 a day or less, according to Dr. Baggett, shrinks Tucson's jury pool even more.
So we get a lot of Raytheon workers, Lockheed workers. It's different than the average juror for a 3 or 4 day trial.
Tucson Judge Richard Fields denied News 4's request for a copy of that questionnaire some 250 prospective jurors filled out this morning, citing that such a release would adversely affect impaneling a jury in this case. And Tom and Christy, again, that trial gets underway February 17th.
Many eyes will be on that case. Thanks, Rebecca.
All right, meantime,
So that gives you an idea what jury consultants do. As you might guess, salary for jury consultants are quite high. Jury consultants can make anywhere from $150,000 to $600,000 a year. So it's a very well-paying job. I've had only one student of mine, a former student of mine, go into jury consulting, and she really enjoys it a whole lot. Okay, well, so I've given you a taste of what the different roles are that psychologists can play in the legal system, and we'll see you next time.